Or suspend for two. Oh, we should be good?
Yeah.
Are we okay? Wonderful. Thanks for letting us know. We'll try to restart with, oh, you're out of time, Mr. Gerard, sorry. No, we'll start with you, Mr. Gerard, for 5 minutes, please. Welcome to OGGO. The floor is yours for 5 minutes, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you.
I'm delighted to have been invited this morning to present to you the kind of the key features of a paper that CG published in July of last year. The title of the paper is squarely framed at the modernization of our regulatory framework in Canada. And the title is Canada Needs Its New Approach to Streamline Digital Rulemaking. Je voulais remercier également
I wanted to thank the committee for having invested resources to have this document translated. So you have it in English and also in French, and it's an excellent translation. I'm very pleased to have had access to that translation.
The paper's focus is about managing safety and innovation in a new world. We now have digital technologies that are clearly outpacing our ability to manage harms through regulations. So the paper is about keeping Canadians safe. And the approach we propose in the paper is to modernize the Statutory Instruments Act. We recommend to formally recognize standards as statutory instruments alongside with regulations. So creating a completely new separate track to achieve compliance with laws alongside with regulations. So the way we look at this, our law legislation is about what you need to do and what are the consequences of not complying with a law, the penalties. Regulations are about how to achieve compliance. And we argue that standards developed by accredited organizations are as efficient in achieving this how to comply with the law than regulations. Today, standards are merely a footnote in the Statutory Instruments Act. They are mentioned as one category of documents that can be incorporated in a regulation. So if you were to establish a separate standards tract, you'd give parliamentarians a power tool. You would give them the ability to force standard setting as soon as a new technology is introduced in the marketplace. It would allow ministers to make standardization requests to the Standards Council of Canada, not for voluntary standards, for mandatory standards, so standards that would have force of law once they are developed. Now, let us be clear, it's not about prohibiting the use of new technologies, but it's about establishing clear requirements with industry and other stakeholders through a credible process to make them safe for use. So you'll look at the paper, you'll see we spent about 10 pages describing the standardization system because it's operating under the radar for many of us, including legislators and regulators. In the paper, you'll find that there are more than 6,000 standards referencing federal, provincial, and territorial regulations. So standards that have been used by regulators since 1927 with the introduction of the Canadian Electrical Code. So it's being used to keep Canadians safe when it comes to tangible products. So if you think about electrical safety, plumbing safety, building safety, it's all safety codes, it's all standards. If you add standards in the mandatory codes that are adopted by provinces and territories, as well as the federal government, you're looking at more than 10,000 standards that are used to keep Canadians safe. So it's a parallel system, but it's an invisible system. In Canada, we have more than 10,000 Canadians participating in development and maintenance of standards. That's a lot of people. I would argue that there are more Canadians developing and maintaining standards in this country than there are regulators. We're seeing the same thing when it comes to digital technologies. So here in Ottawa, we have an organization called the Digital Safety Standards Institute, and they develop standards for digital technologies, whether it's AI, electronic wallets, face recognition technologies. You have them everywhere. And we have thousands of Canadians participating in this. The paper shows as well that in Europe, in the US, in the UK, there are processes in place to direct the development of standards. You want me to?
Past your 5 minutes, if I can
I
get you
am
to
past
wrap
my
up.
5 minutes, but I'm so excited to be here. So to conclude then, we think that establishing this separate track would make sense for Canada. It would improve safety. It would give a tool that you need in order to keep pace with digital technologies. So thank you. I am done.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll get a chance to answer, or you can explain a few other things in the other rounds. Well, I'll go to Ms. Kuzaya, if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Please let me know the correct pronunciation. Please go ahead for 5 minutes, please.
Bonjour.
Hello, and thank you. And you pronounce my name correctly. The Conseil du Patronat du Québec thanks the committee for the opportunity to present its comments as part of its study on the modernization of federal regulations. Legislative and regulatory framework is something that is a key concern for Quebec employers. The CPQ believes that a legislative and regulatory framework that sets too rigid limits on the way companies operate can limit their ability to improve performance and productivity and create wealth. It's a fact that regulations with a laudable objective can often have undesirable consequences that distance us from that objective and can have a negative impact. On the other hand, administrative tasks and the burden of paperwork weigh heavily on the time of managers and business owners, with direct consequences for operations. Delays in obtaining authorizations, for example, for project promoters, duplication, complexity of processes are irritants and disincentives to investment. Streamlined processes and more effective regulation would encourage private investment and improve business productivity and competitiveness, as well as their contribution to prosperity at no cost to the state. It is also worth noting that when you're looking at a bill or a draft regulation, the formalities and their consequences may seem measured, but however, the cumulative effect can be quite a heavy burden for companies. So we have to have an overall view and to consider the accumulation of all these formalities for companies, especially SMEs, and to do everything possible to lighten the burden. We need to look at a focus on regulation, focused regulation on efficiency, results, and predictability. And here are a few recommendations along these lines. First of all, we need to improve the government's approach to regulatory development by ensuring that consultation periods and deadlines are conducive to optimum stakeholder participation and by also involving independent experts. Rigorously analyze, as soon as they are implemented and on an ongoing basis, the real impact on businesses of new regulatory and administrative requirements of legislation passed by the government, and then propose the necessary relief to rapidly reduce the regulatory and administrative burden. Ensure that the impact studies accompanying new legislative or regulatory provisions are based on comments from the sectors involved and the realities on the ground. Provide companies with basic guidelines to facilitate compliance, consistency, and predictability. Of course, harmonize and avoid duplication, both between different departments and agencies and between different levels of government. In this regard, as part of Budget 2023, the federal government said it was prepared to work with the provinces and territories to deepen federal-provincial cooperation to achieve the one project, one evaluation objective, but this has yet to materialize. ensure that companies do not have to repeat certain requests and formalities when situations are identical or when the company has demonstrated exemplary compliance in the past. Work with the provinces to remove barriers to interprovincial trade, including mutual recognition of standards and harmonization of regulations. Draw inspiration from the Quebec government, which has committed to introducing a specific bill each year to promote regulatory and administrative streamlining and has adopted an ambitious plan to reduce the regulatory and admin burden on businesses with quantified targets for controlling volume and costs. Ensure compliance with the one-for-one rule and improve it. So under the current rule, regulators must remove a regulation each time they adopt a new one. This rule focuses solely on regulation. However, increasingly, laws, policies, and guidelines are having a significant impact on businesses and citizens as well. Finally, avoid new regulations that are counterproductive and are not based on a proven need. I think, for example, of C58 on replacement workers. Perhaps this is outside of the scope of the committee, but we wanted to draw your attention to this. And thank you. And I will be more than happy to answer your questions. And we might be able to provide some examples with regards to temporary foreign workers or the Act to Combat Forced Labor and Child Labor in supply chains.
Thanks very much. Unfortunately, our other witnesses haven't been able to log in yet, so we're going to start our opening round. So,
Ms. Furlong just appeared
on
the list.
Ms. Furlong, are you there?
I am. Thank you very much.
Can you turn your camera? Perfect. Just in time. Impeccable timing. If you're ready, we'll go ahead with you for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair and honorable members of the committee, for allowing me to be here today. My name is Shana Furlong. I'm the president and CEO of the Richmond Chamber of Commerce in British Columbia, situated on the traditional territory of the Musqueam Nation. The Richmond Chamber, celebrating its 100th year in 2025, is the longest-standing business organization in our community. As MP Baines will know, Richmond is a tremendously diverse community. It's home to Vancouver International Airport, which brings visitors and newcomers to Canada from around the globe. Richmond's diversity extends beyond demographics to our employers, with over 13,000 businesses employing nearly 130,000 workers. The agri-food sector is significant, given that 39% of Richmond's landmass is dedicated to agriculture. Additionally, our proximity to the U.S. border, airport, and Vancouver Fraser Port Authority make Richmond a major West Coast hub for intermodal transportation and distribution. We also boast an emerging clean tech sector, key local manufacturers, and a significant tourism economy. Today, I'll be highlighting some challenges faced by our employers and suggest potential solutions identified by our chamber network. Regulation and red tape remain a major concern. While we share the goal of making Canada attractive for investment in entrepreneurs, the regulatory burden often acts as a disincentive. In 2006, Canada ranked 4th in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business report, but fell to 23rd in just 14 years, largely attributed to a challenging regulatory environment. Post-pandemic, national productivity has lagged. Reforming Canada's regulatory framework is crucial to our economic competitiveness. In 2023, the Toronto Stock Exchange saw the record net sell-off of $48.7 billion of Canadian equities, indicating a loss of investor confidence. At the same time, Canadian investment abroad has grown significantly, while foreign direct investment in Canada lags, resulting in a net direct investment position of nearly $811 billion, nearly an order of magnitude greater than 10 years prior. As investment dwindles, so too does our GDP per capita. Real GDP growth was only 1.1% in 2023, the lowest since 2016, with GDP per capita now 2.5% below pre-pandemic levels, equating to a decline of about $4,200 per person. Now, despite these challenges, there is great opportunity within Canada for major projects and emerging industries. The clean energy sector, for example, is crucial. According to the Canadian Climate Institute, achieving net zero will require electricity production to increase by 1.6 to 2.1 times, This necessitates significant growth in generation facilities, transmission infrastructure, and distribution networks, requiring public support and streamlined approvals processes. The federal government's own estimates are that we currently have an investment gap of $115 billion annually in clean tech. Unfortunately, Canada's reputation for enabling that necessary investment is a bit challenged. For instance, the Parkland Corporation recently abandoned plans for a $600 million renewable diesel complex in Burnaby, BC, due to rising project costs, market uncertainty, and the competitive advantage of the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. The resources sector also faces long timelines and overlapping review processes. However, the 2022 Critical Mineral Strategy, One Project, One Assessment commitment, is promising and could be applied across all major projects. The Western Transportation Advisory Council's 2024 Compass Report highlights the deteriorating business climate. Over half of respondents rated the regulatory environment as poor, with concerns centered on restrictive regulations and long approval processes. One survey respondent to that, representing a railway operator, said, "It's tough to invest in a geography that has unpredictable rules. At any minute, things could change, and it never seems like they change to help business." To address these issues, we need to take decisive, bold steps as a nation. We believe that Canada can absolutely once again attract much private sector investment domestically and from abroad by implementing an economic competitive mandate for all federal regulators. Leveraging new technologies for regulatory design and review with a focus on efficient implementation and identifying areas of regulatory overlap. And we agree that a firm grasp on the one-for-one rule with an eye to reducing time to project approvals is necessary. So Canada's regulatory environment presents some significant challenges to economic prosperity and our global investment reputation, but by adopting a balanced approach to regulation that protects public interests while promoting economic competitiveness, Canada can reverse its declining productivity and investment trends. Thank you so much for your time and your consideration.
Thanks very much. Our final witness, Mr. D. Tamisis, is still trying to log in. He won't have a camera, so if he's able to log in, I'll let everyone know it'll be audio only. For that witness, we'll start for 6 minutes with Mrs. Kusi, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Furlong, the border officers at the CBSA voted last week in favor of strike action due to the lack of a contract for the last 2 years. Their demands include wage parity, protection from management retaliation, access to telework, and protections from CBSA's obsessive reliance on contracting out. How concerned are you and the businesses that you represent that this border disruption will cause a massive impact on Canadian business?
Thank you so much for the question. It's much appreciated. While I cannot comment on the specific labor negotiations of this union, we saw the huge impact our West Coast port strikes had to the economy as a whole last year. It was measured in the billions of dollars. CBSA is absolutely critical to the movement of goods and people across the border and into our ports. It is unfathomable that we would see another shutdown within a short period of time. And I think this committee knows how critical it is that Canada regain its reputation as a reliable trading partner.
Very well said. My next question was going to be, what would be the impact on Canada's economy if this was to occur? You did mention about the previous incident, the damage being in the billions. Would you like to make any further comment as to the impact on Canada's economy were this to occur?
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I don't have an estimate right now as to the full impact on the economy. I would be happy to do some research and provide that following the meeting.
That would be very much appreciated, Ms. Furlong. Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, one doesn't have to look deeply into recent headlines to see that Canada's economic conditions are declining and consequently eroding the prosperity and living standards of Canadians. Between 2009 and 2018, the number of regulations in Canada grew from 66,000 to 72,000. These regulations, of course, restrict business activity, impose costs on firms, and reduce economic productivity. According to a recent red tape study published by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the cost of regulation from all three levels of government to Canadian businesses totaled $38.8 billion in 2020 for a total of 731 million hours, the equivalent of nearly 375,000 full-time jobs. If we apply a $16.65 per hour cost, the federal minimum wage in Canada for 2023, $12.2 billion annually is lost to regulatory compliance. And of course, as our witnesses know here today, Canada's smallest businesses bear a proportionately high burden of the cost, paying up to 5 times more for regulatory compliance per employee than larger businesses. The smallest businesses pay $7,223 per employee annually to comply with government regulation, while larger businesses pay a much lower $1,237 per employee for regulatory compliance. Certainly not small numbers, Mr. Chair. So, Monsieur Girard, although federal departments and agencies are meant to annually report the regulatory burden they impose on Canadians, this is not legislated and is extremely difficult to access. Why do you think the government is trying to hide this information from Canadians, unlike many of its other provincial counterparts?
Well, I'm not. I think I'm not able to answer that question directly in terms of the regulatory costs. I think there is a need to understand a lot better how we frame compliance, both through standards and regulations, and what are the impacts of creating new regulations. And I don't see a lot of reports on outcomes. That would be my interest, is figuring out what are the what are the expectations we have in terms of laws when we pass new laws, and how do we measure whether we're getting there. I'm not seeing that, unfortunately. So we're focusing on the process. We're not really focusing on the outcomes.
Right. The federal government has a one-for-one rule building its regulatory framework, which means for every new regulatory cost, as outlined by another witness, it must be offset by an equal or greater reduction. Has this government been following through on this commitment, would you say?
Well, given what you just mentioned before, I'm assuming no. And I think that the track that I'm proposing in the paper would help reduce the regulatory burden. If we took a hard look at compliance to laws through standards as opposed to regulations, and standards are co-designed by industry and academics and regulators, you'd probably be able to find a way to reduce the regulatory burden while keeping Canadians safe. That would be my sense. That taking a look at standards as opposed to full-fledged regulations would keep Canadians safe, but would reduce the burden on industry.
Correct. Because as I mentioned, the cost of regulation, according to the CFIB, was $38.8 billion in 2020 and took a total of $731 million. Can you comment further on how much of Canada's business would be improved by removing the billions in dollars of costs in regulation?
Actually, I have to interrupt because that is our time. Perhaps
Thank you.
we can save
Thank
it
you very
for
much, Monsieur Girard. Thank
response
you.
when Conservatives up next. Mr. Baines, over to you, sir, please.
Mr. Chair, and thank you to Monsieur Girard for being here, and of course all of our other witnesses online. My first question will be directed to the Richmond Chamber of Commerce. Surprise, surprise. And thank you, Ms. Furlong, for joining us today, of course, online from Richmond, BC. I know you explained in considerably how much impact the different types of businesses we have in Richmond, land, sea, air. It's a major hub. We have a lot of technology there, and even the moon. I know we have a company that's put the camera on the rover on the moon. So let's just add space to that as well. And I know that the Chamber does a lot of hard work on producing reports, conducting studies, and and providing feedback. So that is a primary piece of what we try to look for in this committee, looking for recommendations. Last year, one of your policies, or many of your policies, were adopted by the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Could you briefly summarize for the committee what these policies were?
I'd be happy to share that. Thank you so much. So we had two policies that went forward to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and a third that we were supporting. The third I'll speak about first. It was focused on Canadian-made supply of sustainable aviation fuel. We often find that in Canada, our sustainable aviation fuel is refined abroad, and it is shipped to North America, often at great expense, which actually calls into question how sustainable it is. When we're refining in Singapore and fueling in Los Angeles, it really challenges Canadian airlines in their green technology and in their future sustainability plans. Another policy we brought forward was calling for federal adoption of a permanent transit fund for municipalities across Canada. That is something that MP Baines, you will know, has been championed very hard by Metro Vancouver's Mayor's Council, and we're firmly in agreement there. Workers need to be able to get to their places of employment, and people need to be able to move around the regions. And the third policy we brought forward was seeking greater support for port infrastructure and project approval timelines across the country. In our backyard, we've seen the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority's Robert Bank Terminal 2 project take over a decade for its environmental approval. And now they are currently in the process of working with Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Because the expansion of port capacity at Roberts Bank Terminal 2 is so critical to the businesses, not only in our region in British Columbia, but across the country, we believe that moving more quickly on significant projects like this will not only help control costs for Canadian consumers, taxpayers, and businesses, but also help us create great jobs more quickly and at the time we need them.
Okay, and staying with the ports, I had the opportunity to participate in some of the digital technologies that were announced with respect to seamless communication by large commercial shipping companies and logistics at the Vancouver Ports terminals. Why is that important? Can you maybe explain how would this improve the port activity and what role the provinces and territories would have in this?
Thank you so much. I have to say I am absolutely not an expert on this subject, but I believe I've seen some of the same presentations you have. What we are seeing with the ports is that we need to move more goods more quickly. We are seeing products reaching Canada just-in-time deadlines, and those products need to move through our logistics companies into the market very, very quickly. The use of digital technology to manage the workforce, manage transportation on the ground, and at freight is absolutely critical. And I'm very excited to see what's coming forward. And I'm sorry I don't have more information for you.
That's totally fine. I'm going to ask a little bit more about, you will recall, like years ago, the provincial government, while I was working there, we actually had a ministry dedicated to deregulation. And with over 80,000 different regulations were removed and changed. Is there a risk with that associated? Because we did see, for example, a real estate industry in British Columbia that went unregulated for years. We had issues where the homes were being flipped, contracts of homes were being flipped month after month, adding $50,000 value to each contract before it was actually closed, the sales were closed. So maybe talk a little bit about risks associated with deregulation.
Thank you. I think we would all agree that a perfect regulatory environment is going to balance the public good, public safety, with the interests of business and our broader economy. I'll give you one example. The way we regulate sunscreen in Canada. If you go to the United States, you can pick up a bottle of sunscreen for much less money, and there's more options. Here in Canada, we regulate sunscreen as a drug or a natural health product, and companies spend quite a bit of money jumping through many hoops with Health Canada to get approval in Canada. So when you go into a Canadian drugstore or to a Canadian cosmetics company, you're going to see many fewer options, and those options are going to be significantly more expensive. Now, that's just a very small segment of the economy, but I think we can see it across all industries. When we have a regulatory burden that, yes, is protecting the individual or broader social good, is it balanced with other jurisdictions? Because we have to remember we are not an island. We are competing with other jurisdictions across the globe for investment and project approval, but also general public interest.
Thank you very much. Before we go to Mrs. Vignola, Mr. De Tomasis has managed to come online. If it's okay with everyone, we'll go through Mrs. Vignola, then Mr. Backrack, then we'll allow the witness to do a 5-minute opening before we start again. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Mrs. Vignola, go ahead, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for being here today. And thank you to my colleagues. When we talk about modernization, and I would like to speak with Mr. Girard to start with. When we talk about modernization of federal regulations, I understand that we're trying to simplify or streamline, but it doesn't mean that we are less responsible, that things are less safe, and there seems to be a certain resistance to change. And I have 2 questions. Here's my first. Modernization of regulations and tools would have what would be the advantages for civil servants who use these tools? And my second question, how can we change an organizational culture? Thank you, Mrs. Vignola. With regards to the first question, if we would set out a new way for regulatory authorities to develop new ways for businesses to comply with the laws. If we want to do this with standardization, there's a new tool that can be used and that they don't have right now, and so it would be possible to facilitate the creation of technical committees with industry, with academics, with all stakeholders that are involved to reach a consensus in a credible process. So this opens doors to regulatory authorities, to civil servants to find win-win situations, win-win solutions. Secondly, by using standards, a standard has to be reviewed every 5 years. So it's not static, it's something dynamic. This allows the regulatory authorities to continue the conversation, to continue a dialogue with stakeholders, and to raise the bar when we find that there are problems. And so this is how the system works. And the regulatory authorities participate in standardization for 100 years now. So it's nothing new, but in new sectors or emergent sectors such as high tech, this is new. So we're giving them a chance. They've been given an opportunity to open the door and to have discussions, to have requirements that we can review and that we can certify. With regards to culture change, as member of the committee, it's important for you to look over this because there is a resistance to change. There is a resistance on behalf of civil servants, and perhaps that's justified. But we fear risk. We fear new approaches because we don't want negative consequences if a mistake is made. So education around this, what I would suggest is to help regulatory authorities to understand how the system works and to give them the permission, open and explicit permission to use the system rather than hiding behind the tried and true solutions that have been used for almost 150 years now with traditional processes for regulatory measures. So here in Canada, we have no opportunity to have AI regulations until 2028. And so that doesn't make any sense. If we had a standard system, if we had requests for AI, we would be able to have standards that could be applied within a year. A year is not great, but it's better than 2028. So we can innovate and we can change the culture, but I think that you should definitely study this. Thank you, Mr. Girard. My next question is once again for yourself, but also for Mrs. Kozaya. The lowering of productivity in a country, is this being led by regulation? I have a few basic economics classes, and in my memory, the increase or reduction of productivity has a multiple is for multiple causes. The economic theories, as we teach in our high schools, have things changed? If not, what are the other factors that have an influence on productivity of a country, and which ones are currently having an impact on productivity in Quebec and Canada? I'll give the floor to the Quebec Employers Council, but what I can tell you is that if there's no regulatory alignment between different jurisdictions, this does create problems for the industry. The industry then has to develop and certify 2 or 3, 4 times throughout the country for a market of 40 million people. So this can reduce productivity. But of course, regulatory alignment is important. However, if we have regulations, it's protect people. If we have people who are killed by electrical systems that are malfunctioning, we're going to see an increase in costs elsewhere. So we have to use a balanced approach. Regulation doesn't necessarily mean that productivity will go down. We really have to focus and examine things, what's important, not just make sweeping statements such as that. Thank you. So it's not the only aspect, in your opinion. It's one, but not the only one. Mrs. Kozaya, thank you for the question. It's not the only factor. Productivity is linked to many different things, everything linked to training, education, human capital, and a better trained workplace that's able to adapt. We can say that our productivity will increase due to this. There are fiscal measures that are important. We have to invest in capital, and also there's a predictability linked to capital and investment. The regulatory environment is one of the issues, but there's all kinds of infrastructure also. We spoke about transportation and other types of infrastructure, so there are many factors, but governments can have an impact on regulatory issues without it being a huge cost. It's not to provide a tax break. We want to have results, and I think it's important to work ahead of the curve with businesses to determine and decide that there will be no undesirable effects that have an impact on productivity.
Please. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses. Mr. Girard, I found your presentation interesting when it comes to the use of standards versus regulations. And I think when you were finishing up your statement, you were talking about the experience in other countries and how they've established standards in perhaps a more fulsome way. Could you just complete that thought and share with the committee what other countries are doing that we should look to?
Okay. Thank you very much for that question. It's a very good question. The title of the paper is, we need to establish a new approach, and new approach is in quotation mark. That's a reference to the EU approach. So since 1985, the European Commission has the authority to make standardization requests to its standards body. I was just out of university in 1985. Some of you were still in high school, I'm sure, or primary school, perhaps some of you. So it's been a long time. So if you think the example of AI, you know that in Europe there was a law regarding high-risk AI applications. It was passed in March. Well, in December of last year, the European Commission asked its standard body to develop 10 standards to frame compliance to its new legislation, its upcoming legislation. So from data collection to ensuring that privacy requirements are met, documentation, conformity assessment, it's all there. So the European Union has a mechanism to mandate the development of standards. And the other thing too about that is once the standard is out, there is a presumption of conformity. So once the standard is out, the regulators have helped design that standard. When it's published, it becomes part of the legislative tool. It is, industry has to comply with it. In the US, you have executive orders from the White House. So the White House regularly asks its National Institute on Standards and Technology, NIST, to develop standards so that products and systems are safer. They've done it for smart grid. They're doing it for AI now. In the UK, they've designed a Standards Institute for AI, and they approve standards in a list of recognized standards. They don't even need a regulation. You can put them on a website, and people know they have to comply to these standards. Long answer to your question.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. I'll try to fit in one more question. It's a very interesting distinction between standards and regulation, and it seems one of the key distinctions in my mind is that the standards agencies are entirely arm's length from lawmakers, from the government. And so I guess the question is around the trade-off when it comes to accountability. So, you've mentioned the application when it comes to AI. The other safety regulation and legislation that we're currently debating is the Online Harms Act, which speaks very much to safety. But it seems like if we were to empower an arm's length standards body to come up with standards for online harm, they're going to be making a lot of very subjective, like already in the legislation, there are serious questions about definitions, about concepts, about society's expectations around online safety. We would now be talking about empowering an unaccountable body to make these determinations. Are there limits to what standards bodies should be empowered with?
Excellent question again. So when you develop a standard, you have a technical committee, and it has to have a balanced matrix of interests, including regulators. So first thing is regulators are at the table. Regulators influence the process. Regulators vote. If regulators as a block say, we don't like this standard, it doesn't meet our requirements, it's not going to help you comply with our legislation, it's not going to go anywhere. So regulators have a really important role to play in designing standards, especially when they're mandatory, when you know it's going to become part of the law. So that's one thing. The other thing is, if you have a standard internationally that you think would work, you can bring it to Canada, review it, and adapt it. If you think that some features are not strong enough, you can make deviations to it and then come up with something that works for you. So this issue is, it's a new tool you have in your toolbox. You're at the table, you make the decisions with industry, with academics, with experts, but you have the last word when it comes to the actual content of the document that you'll adopt.
But riddle me this, it sounds an awful lot like the process for creating regulations. Like, where's the distinction?
The distinction is in the way that the standard system works. It has the right checks and balances. It forces people to make decisions, thinking through the issues. And when it comes to digital governance, our Digital Standards Institute in Canada can develop a standard within a year. So that's a big difference between what we're doing on the standard front and what is being done with regulations.
I think I could probably dig deeper on that topic because I find the difference somewhat nuanced. But I'll ask just about, we've heard a lot about this idea of add one regulation, take one regulation away. And it seems to me that this is an oversimplification of the challenge that we're faced with. Not every regulation is created equal. Some are very complex, some are very simple. Should we be not focused more on the efficiency of the regulatory process rather than the number of regulations?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure that this one-to-one, applied generically will work for you. But what I know is that, when you think about standards in federal, provincial, and territorial regulations, close to 10,000 of them, we know they're useful, and we know that they're dynamic and flexible, And we know that the tangible world we live in, the tangible products you use every day, it's not regulated, it's standardized, and it's safe. So there's got to be a way for us to think about this in terms of, do we really need a regulation for this? Or can we afford to take a standard approach and achieve the same results? And then you look at the outcomes. And if it works, then you save Canadians a lot of money and a lot of time. Thank you.
Thanks. We're now going to go to Mr. De Tomasis for your opening statement. Are you there, sir? We understand your camera's not working, but your mic is.
Microphone should be working, yes. My apologies on the technical difficulties with my camera.
That's okay. Go ahead. You've got 6 minutes. Go ahead, sir. Or 5 minutes. Sorry, I apologize. Go ahead, sir.
No problem. Well, good morning. I wanted to thank everyone for allowing me the opportunity to speak. And what I'm here to speak today about is some of the challenges that we're encountering at our deepwater port in the Port of Windsor. More Term Limited is located in Windsor. It's located a stone's throw from North America's busiest international border with the U.S. Some of the challenges that we're facing is with movement of goods back and forth from Canada into the U.S. and then back from the U.S. into Canada. Customers would like to simplify the regulatory process by cutting the unnecessary red tape to make cross-border trade easier. We have identified challenges with moving product across borders once the shipments arrive at our warehouse and at the Port of Windsor. More-term customers would like the option of shipping product not only by truckload, but by cargo, by the entire cargo that arrives at our terminal. Much of the product that we handle at More-term is steel, aluminum, steel plate, project cargo, those types of commodities, which could be moved by one lot as opposed to individual truckloads, which creates a lot of red tape and administrative work for the customers and More-term. If we could propose a few solutions to help streamline the process, they would include, a trusted carrier, fast pass type of solution that is similar to what the auto carriers and other OEMs use in North America. Another solution could be the development of a free trade zone in the Windsor area, where customers could land product or commodities in Windsor for further shipment into the U.S. Currently, More-term does have a bonded area in one of our warehouses, and customers do take advantage of this for convenience to move, products back and forth, but the area is limited and it's fairly small. I also would like to talk about another possible solution, and this is a sufferance warehouse. We are continually being asked by customers in Europe and in the US about moving product into the Windsor area or Canada and landing it in a sufferance warehouse where product could be stored, and then product could be moved in and out of the sufferance warehouse under one bond or limited paperwork. There is a real need for sufferance warehouse in our location. We believe it's a strategic location in North America where products could move to and fro very easily and very quickly. We are a multimodal facility with rail connections to CP, KC, and CN, and then we also have a direct connection to CSX in the US. So customers are eagerly looking at bringing cargo into Windsor because of the connections to the 400 series highways, North American highways, and rail shipments. So we would love to be able to continue these discussions and look at some solutions that would make sense for More-term and for Canada.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll now go to Mrs. Block for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I echo my colleagues' comments in welcoming you all here today, albeit by Zoom for many of you, but Mr. Girard, welcome to the room. My first question will be for Ms. Furlong. Firstly, congratulations on almost reaching 100 years, and I'm sure you're busy preparing for that celebration. In a previous meeting, we heard from witnesses that the carbon tax rebate in the amount of $2.5 billion has been withheld from the current government from small and medium-sized businesses across Canada. Now, in the budget 2024, they've indicated that they plan to finally return the money to these small businesses, and I'll quote what the budget actually says. Budget 2024 proposes to urgently return fuel charge proceeds from 2019-20 through 2023-24 to an estimated 600,000 businesses with 499 or fewer employees. I'm wondering if you could comment on the impact or any feedback that you've received on the impact of the carbon tax and whether or not your members are aware of this newfound urgency to return this money to them and the process for doing so.
Thank you for the question, Mrs. Block. The carbon tax works a little bit differently in British Columbia than it does in other provinces in Canada. So I would be very happy to reach out to my colleagues at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and share their perspectives on the way this is affecting businesses in those provinces. But unfortunately, I can't provide much input to that question.
Okay. Thank you. Have you heard from any of your members in regards to a process for having that returned, or are you telling me that because of this difference with British Columbia, they would not be receiving any kind of a rebate?
The carbon tax is administered provincially in British Columbia, so we would not be under the same federal regime for rebates.
Okay, thank you very much. For both you and Mr. DeThomasis, I am wondering if you are at all aware that Minister Anand, as President of the Treasury Board, is required to publish an annual report on federal regulatory management initiatives under the Red Tape Reduction Act. And this was an act that was introduced by the previous Conservative government back in 2012. Are you aware of this report? Have you or any of your members or customers had an opportunity to review this report? And I'll pass it over to Ms. Furlong first and then Mr. DeThomasis.
Thank you so much. I have not read this report. I am aware of its requirements, but no, I have not seen it myself.
Yes, I haven't had a chance to review it. I was aware that there is a report, but I have not had a chance to review it in detail.
Okay, thank you very much. The current government tends to introduce either deeply flawed or deliberately vague proposed legislation, leaving the details to the bureaucrats through regulation. And I'm wondering if you've given any thought to the kind of advice that you would provide to the next government, who will most likely be a Conservative government, what you would like to see implemented in the first 100 days following the next election.
Sorry, was that question directed to me?
To any one of you that would like to provide any advice on regulatory changes that need to be made.
Thank you, Mrs. Block. Well, I will jump in first. Regardless of the next government that is formed, and the Richmond Chamber of Commerce, like all chambers of commerce, is strictly nonpartisan, but we believe very strongly that introducing economic competitiveness mandates across all federal regulators would be an absolutely fantastic first step in ensuring that economic competitiveness is measured across regulators and they are accountable to it.
Thanks. That is our time. Mr. Kuzmierczak, please.